the London Mail, at the end of its journey. 500 miles of track lay behind it in the darkness, all the way to Euston and last night. Now it was coming to rest. And only one person in all its crowded length did not sigh with relief at the realization. Of those who sighed, at least two sighed with a gladness that bordered on passion. One of these was a passenger, and the other was a railway employee. The passenger was Alan Grant, and the railway employee was Murdo Gallacher. Murdo Gallacher was a sleeping car attendant and the best-hated living creature between Thurso and Torquay. To first-class passengers far and wide he was known as Old Yuggert. The third-class passengers called him a variety of things, both frank and descriptive. For 20 years Murdo Gallacher had done the absolute minimum. He might have retired years ago, but he could not bear the thought of losing his full pension, so he endured the boredom a little longer and hailed the end of each journey with the relief of a man who is working out his sentence. Alan Grant, watching the lights of the yard beyond the steamed-up window, was glad because the end of the journey was the end of a night's suffering. Grant had spent the night trying not to open his door into the corridor. Wide awake, he had lain and sweated, not because the compartment was too hot, but because... misery, mortification. Because it represented a small enclosed space. Overwork, the doctor called it. "Sit back and browse for a little," he said, crossing one elegant Wimpole Street leg over the other. Grant could not imagine himself sitting back, and browse, indeed. The very sound of the word was an offence. "You any hobbies?" the doctor had asked. "No," Grant had said shortly. "What do you do when you go on holiday?" "I fish." "Oh, you fish," said the psychologist. "And you don't consider that a hobby?" "Well, certainly not." "What is it then, would you say?" "Something between a sport and a religion." At that, Wimpole Street had smiled, and assured him that his cure was only a matter of time. Time and relaxation. Well, at least Grant had managed not to open that door last night, but he was drained and empty. To have opened that door would have meant an unconditional surrender to the forces of unreason. But now, in the unrewarding dark of early morning, he thought, what have I got to show for it? His pride, he supposed. Pride that he had not opened a door that there was no reason not to open. Oh, God. He opened the door now, wishing that he could throw himself back on that rumpled couch and sleep and sleep and sleep. He picked up the 2 suitcases which old Yuggert had not offered to do anything about, tucked a bundle of unread periodicals under his arm and went out into the corridor. As he did so, Yuggert himself came from his cubbyhole to make sure that number B7 was aware that they were nearly at the terminus. He knocked loudly on the door and went in. As Grant came level with the open door, Yuggert was shaking B7, who was lying fully dressed on the bunk, and saying to him, in choked exasperation, "Come on, sir, come on, we're practically in." He looked up as Grant's shadow darkened the door and said disgustedly, "Tight as an owl." The compartment was solid with the reek of whisky, Grant noticed. Automatically, he picked up the newspaper that Yuggert's shaking had dislodged onto the compartment floor and straightened the man's jacket. "Can't you recognise a dead man when you see one?" Grant said. Through a haze of his tiredness, he heard his own voice say it. "Dead!" said Yuggert in a kind of howl. "It can't be. I'm due to go off. How was I to know anyone was drinking themselves to death in my coach? What'll I do?" "Report it to the police, of course," Grant said. He looked again at the young face, with the rumpled dark hair and reckless eyebrows, and went away down the corridor. Dead men were not his responsibility. He'd had his fill of dead men in his time, and although he had never quite lost a heart contraction at its irrevocability, death had no longer the power to shock him. On the platform, Grant stumbled up the steps and across the bridge, stepped out into the empty courtyard of the hotel. Presently, Tommy would come and pick him up, and they would drive away into the great, clean Highland country where people died only in their beds. No one bothered to shut a door anyway, because it was too much trouble. In the hotel dining room, he ate what breakfast the waitress put in front of him, and began to feel better. And presently she came back, removed the slices of cut bread, and put in their place a plate of morning rolls. "Here's the baps to you," she said. "They've just this minute come." She pushed the marmalade nearer to his hand and went away again. Grant reached for one of the unread papers from last night's store. What came to hand was a London evening paper, and he looked at it with a puzzled lack of recognition. Had he bought an evening paper? Surely he had read it at the normal hour of 4 o'clock in the afternoon. Why buy another at 7 o'clock in the evening? The paper was a signal. Grant looked at the headlines, pushed the thing away from him, but as he reached out a hand for the next in the pile, he noticed that the blank space for the stop-press news bore scribblings in pencil. He turned the paper round so that he could see. It was someone's attempt at verse. An original work, not an attempt to remember some verse already known. The writer had filled in 2 missing lines by ticking in the required number of feet. And suddenly Grant knew where the paper had come from. He had put it under his arm when he picked it up as it slipped to the floor of compartment B7. His conscious mind was concerned with the disarray that Yoggart was making of a helpless man. Grant had needed a free hand, so the paper had gone under his arm with the rest. So the young man with the tumbled black hair and the reckless eyebrows had been a poet, had he? Grant looked with interest at the pencilled words. The writer had designed his effort in 8 lines, it seemed, but had not been able to think of the 5th and 6th, so that the scribble had read, "The beasts that talk, the streams that stand, the stones that walk, the singing sand, that guard the way to paradise." Grant considered the matter. The writing was unformed, but not at all shaky. The writing of an adult who'd never quite grown up. The shapes of the capital letters were pure copybook. Odd that so individual a creature had had no desire to impress his individuality on the form of his letters. One of Grant's milder interests had for years been this business of handwriting, and in general it proved a very good index to a man. Considering the high degree of intelligence that had put into words that nightmare hazard at the gates of paradise, it was obvious that it was not a lack of personality that had kept the young man's writing adolescent. His vitality and interest had gone into something else. Into what? Something active, something extrovert. But he was introvert enough to have analysed that country of the moon on the way to his paradise. Introvert enough to have stood apart and looked at it, to have wanted to record it. Grant noted the tightly joined tops of the N's and M's. A liar or just secretive? Curiously cautious trait to appear in the writing of a man with those eyebrows. It was a strange thing how much the meaning of a countenance depended on eyebrows. And it was the slant of the black eyebrows that had given that thin white face on the pillow its reckless look, even in death. Well, the man had been sober when he wrote those words, that at least was clear. That toper's oblivion in compartment B7, the empty bottle rolling about on the floor, the overturned glass on the shelf, may have been the paradise he sought, but he was sober when he blueprinted the way to it. The singing sand. Surely there were actual singing sands somewhere. It had a vaguely familiar sound. Singing sands. They cried out under your feet as you walked, or the wind did it, or something. A man's forearm in a checked tweed sleeve reached in front of him and took a bap from his plate. "You seem to be doing yourself very well," Tommy said, pulling out a chair and sitting down. He split the bap and buttered it. Grant looked at him in silence and with affection. It was so like Tommy not to waste time on conventional inquiries as to his journey and his health. Neither would Laura, of course. They would accept him as he stood, as if he had never gone away at all. It was an extraordinary, restful atmosphere to slip back into. "How's Laura?" "Oh, never better. Putting on a bit of weight. At least that's what she says. I don't see it myself. I've never liked skinny women." There'd been a time, when they were both about 20, when Grant had thought of marrying his cousin Laura. And she, he'd been sure, had thoughts of marrying him. But before any word had been said, the magic had faded and they were back on the old friendly footing. The magic had been part of the long intoxication of a Highland summer. He still had a lifting of the heart when he thought of that summer. But they'd both gone on to other things, to other people. He'd taken her to that old boys' dance and she'd met Tommy Rankin, and that had been that. "What's the fuss at the station?" Tommy asked. "Ambulances and things." "A man died on the train, I expect it's that." "Oh," said Tommy, dismissing it. He turned his serious, childlike gaze on Grant and said, "They'll miss you on the embankment. There'll be one short, won't they?" Grant expelled his breath in the nearest he'd come to a laugh for months. "Sick leave?" Bryce had said, his little elephant eyes running over Grant's healthy-looking frame with disgust. "What is the force coming to?" There had been a subtle suggestion that Grant was malingering, that he'd already arranged his fishing flies before going to Wimpole Street. "What'll they do to fill the gap?" Tommy asked. "Promote Sergeant Williams, probably. His promotion's long overdue, anyhow." It had been no easier to tell the faithful Williams. When your subordinate has openly hero-worshipped you for years, it's not pleasant to have to appear before him as a poor, nerve-ridden creature at the mercy of non-existent demons. It had not been easy to tell Williams and see the admiration change to concern, to pity. "Push over the marmalade," Tommy said. The peace induced by Tommy's matter-of-fact acceptance of him deepened as they drove into the hills. The landscape was tidy and bare. Only a willow here and there showed live green in the half-shades. This is what he had needed. This space, this serenity. "The river's very low, isn't it?" he said to Tommy as the car came down into the valley of the Turley. And he was invaded by panic. That was the way it always happened. One moment a sane, self-possessed human being, the next a helpless creature in the grip of unreason. He pressed his hands together and tried to listen to what Tommy was saying. They'd had no rain for weeks. Let him think about the lack of rain. If they didn't have rain, there would be no run of fish, no water for them. Oh, God, help me not to make Tommy stop. Look at the river, look at it. Why should he mind Tommy's knowing? There was nothing shameful about it. Could not even light a cigarette in case his hands were shaking too much. Perhaps if he did something, however trivial. He took the bundle of papers from the seat by his side, shuffling them without point, and noticed that the signal was not among them. He'd meant to take it with him because of that odd little verse in the stop press, but he must have left it in the hotel dining room. Oh, well. Didn't matter. The owner certainly would not want it again. For the first time it occurred to Grant to wonder what had brought the young man to the north at this bleak and unfashionable season. Why? To fish? To climb? Apart from sport, what was there? Official business? No, not with that face, no. An actor. An artist, just possibly. A sailor going to join his ship, now that was possible. The face would look very well on the bridge of a ship. And what else was there? What would bring a dark, thin young man with reckless eyebrows and a passion for alcohol to the Highlands at the beginning of March? Grant looked down at his hands and found they were still. The dead young man had saved him. He looked up and saw in front of him the white house of Clun. A blue curl of smoke rose up from the chimney into the still air. It was the fine essence of peace. As they drove up the sandy track from the road, he saw Laura come out of the door and stand waiting for them, just as she used to be waiting on the little Badenoch platform for him when she was a child. Laura kissed him on both cheeks, took one look at him and said, "I have a lovely bird for your lunch, but you look as if a good long sleep would do you more good. So go straight up and have it, and forget about food until you waken. We've got weeks to gossip in, so we don't need to start right now." Only Laura, he thought, would have streamlined her hostess role to a guest's need so neatly. He wondered whether it was that he looked a wreck, or whether it was just that Laura knew him so well. It occurred to him that he would not mind Laura's knowing about his bondage of fear. It was odd that where he had shrunk from exhibiting his weakness to Tommy, he should not care that Laura might learn about it. Should have been the other way round. And then he realised that his lack of desire to conceal from Laura his fits of panic was proof that no small, remote part of him was still in love with her. "Don't come down until you want to," Laura said, preceding him up the stairs. "Don't come down at all if it comes to that. Just ring when you waken." Her footsteps went away down the passage and the silence flooded in behind her. He stripped off his clothes and, without bothering to pull a curtain over the light, he fell into bed. Presently he opened his eyes and found that the light was no longer coming in at the window. He realised that it was late afternoon. Somewhere far away was the sound of tea and preparation. He got up and went downstairs, conscious that he was hungry for the first time in months. Saturday morning was bright and rainless. It was suggested that Grant should go trout fishing in the loch with Laura's 9-year-old son Pat as gillie. Being gillie was obviously Pat's idea of heaven. "I have a fish for you," he said, in the accent his mother called clotted Perthshire. "Under the ledge in the kiddie pool. You can have a line of a fly if you like." So Grant set off up the sandy path through the dry heather, with Pat at his side and one pace in the rear, like a gun dog on its best behaviour. And as he went, Grant was conscious of his own reluctance, and wondered at it. Why should there be any qualification in his pleasure this morning, in his delight in going fishing? Why the small unwillingness at the back of his mind? They'd walked for a mile before he'd flushed the reason from the cover of his subconscious. He'd wanted to stay at Clun today so that he could see the daily paper when it arrived. He wanted to find out about B7. Nearly 24 hours later, B7 was still with him, it seemed. The beasts that talk, the streams that stand, the stones that walk, the singing sand. What had it stood for? Was it just a country of the mind? They launched the light boat from its wooden runway, and Grant pulled out into the loch and made for the windward end. He watched Pat put his rod together, and thought that if he could not have the felicity of possessing a son, then a small red-headed cousin made a very good substitute. They fished turnabout in a fine male amity. At noon they turned inshore to make tea on the primus in the little bothy. Grant saw Pat's eye fixed on something along the shore, and turned to see what occasioned such a marked distaste. He looked at the advancing figure with its shugly body and inappropriate magnificence, and asked who that might be.
"That's wee Archie,"
said Pat. Wee Archie was wielding a shepherd's crook that no shepherd would be found dead with, and wearing a kilt that no Highlander would dream of being found alive in. His small dark head was crowned by a pale blue balmoral at such a dashing angle that the slack covered his right ear. The socks on his hairpin legs were a brilliant blue and so hairy in texture that they gave the effect of some unfortunate growth. "What's he doing around here?" Grant asked, fascinated.
"He lives at the inn at Moy Moor."
"Oh, and what does he do?"
"He writes poems. He's a egg."
Grant concluded that the word Pat had sought was amoeba, but that knowledge had not reached him so far. The lowest form of life he knew of was the egg. The egg came blithely towards them along the stony beach.
"Come in a hashiv,"
he called in a thin, bodiless voice as he came within hailing distance. Grant bade the man good morning.
"Patrick should have told you. It was too bright to fish today,"
Archie said, swinging up to them. The freckles on Pat's fair skin were lost in a red tide. Speech trembled on his lips. "Well, I expect he didn't want to do me out of my pleasure," Grant said smoothly, and watched the tide recede.
"You've come ashore for your livenses, I take it,"
wee Archie said brightly.
"I'll be glad to join you if you've no objection."
So they made tea for wee Archie, glum and polite. He produced his own sandwiches, and while they ate he lectured them on how good he was in a boat. It was thanks only to his skill in a boat that he and 4 others had reached a Hebridean beach alive last year. He asked if Grant knew the islands, the herring fleets of Lewis, the cliffs of Mingulay, and the sands, the endless, wonderful white sand of Bernery. Grant said he did not. "The sands don't sing, I suppose," he said.
"No,"
said wee Archie, "no.
They're in Claddagh."
"What are?" asked Grant, startled.
"The singing sands."
Archie decided it was time that he was wending his way. Archie never went anywhere. He always wended his way towards Moy Moor.
"Well, good fishing to you."
He swung away along the shore. Grant stood motionless, watching him go. When he was nearly beyond earshot, Grant called to him suddenly.
"Are there any walking stones on Claddagh?" "No, they're in Lewis."
And the dragonfly creature with its mosquito voice went away into the brown distance. They came home at tea-time with 5 unimpressive-looking trout and large appetites. In the sitting-room, Tommy was dripping honey onto a hot scone and Laura was pouring tea. Seeing Grant's searching eye, she asked him if he was looking for something. Yes, the daily paper.
"The Clarion?"
asked Pat. Grant took the tidily folded paper from Pat ceremoniously and unfolded it with controlled interest. It was a Scottish edition, and there seemed to be nothing about yesterday's railway event in it. At last he came on it, a tiny paragraph. "Man dies in train," said the inconspicuous heading, and under the heading was a succinct statement. On the arrival of the Flying Highlander at its destination yesterday morning, it was found that one of the passengers, a young Frenchman, Charles Martin, had died during the night. It's understood that the death was due to natural causes, but since the death occurred in England, the body is being returned to London for an inquest.
"French,"
he said aloud. Surely not, surely not. The face, yes, perhaps, but not that writing. That very English schoolboy writing. It was an oddity. And in the case of sudden death, however natural, oddities have importance. Now B7 had become the subject of an inquest, a professional matter. and it occurred to Grant, for the first time, that his abstraction of the newspaper might be held to be a little irregular. It had been an entirely accidental purloining, but it had, if one had to be analytical about it, been a removal of evidence. He was still considering the matter when he went to bed. But before he went to sleep, he decided that he should write to Bryce in the morning. He'd take the opportunity of putting himself in the right by passing the knowledge of the newspaper's presence on to those whom it might concern. Grant asked Tommy at breakfast if he might borrow the car to go to Scone to post an important letter, and Laura offered to drive him. They'd gone 2 miles when, quite suddenly, came the realization that he was in a car, that he was shut into a car. He let down the window on his side to its fullest extent, but the tide of panic rose with a slow, abominable menace. Now it was round his chest so that he could hardly breathe. Now it was up in his throat. In a moment it would be over his mouth. "Lala, stop!" "Stop the car?" she asked, surprised. "Yes." She brought the car to a standstill, and he got out on trembling legs. "You feeling ill, Alan?" she asked anxiously. "No, I just wanted to get out of the car." "Oh," she said in a relieved tone. "Claustrophobia. I thought you were ill." "And you don't call that being ill?" he said bitterly. "Of course not. I nearly died of terror once when I was taken to see the Cheddar Caves." He looked round and down at her, the strain fading from his expression. She held up a cigarette case to him. "Poor Alan. If I overworked the way you do, I'd be a raving maniac. I'd probably have claustrophobia and agoraphobia and make medical history." "Oh, Lala, darling," he said, beginning to laugh. "Well, it's nice that you can still laugh, even if it's at me," she said. "Next time, don't wait until you're on the point of suffocation." He didn't know which he found more reassuring, her awareness that the thing was a sort of suffocation, or her matter-of-fact acceptance of unreason. If Grant had imagined that his chief would be gratified by his punctiliousness in the matter of the newspaper, he was wrong. In the first paragraph of his reply, Bryce rebuked Grant for his unprofessional conduct. In the second paragraph, he was surprised that Grant should have thought of bothering a busy department with any matter as trivial as that of a purloined paper. There was no third paragraph. And now Grant became aware that, beyond his conscientious need to put himself straight with the department, had been the desire to hang on to B7. He'd hoped, without knowing it, that his colleagues might be chatty on the subject. He might have known Bryce better. However, there was always Sergeant Williams, thank heaven. So, to Williams, he wrote. Would he find out what the result of the inquest had been on a young man, Charles Martin, who had died on Thursday night about a week ago on the night train to the Highlands? And kind regards to Mrs. Williams and Angela and Leonard. For 5 days he waited. And then it came. Williams hoped that Grant wasn't hankering after work. He was supposed to be having a rest. As to Charles Martin, there was no mystery about his death. He'd hit the back of his head against the edge of the porcelain washhand basin and had died from internal hemorrhage after falling over. The fact that he'd fallen backwards at all was due to the amount of neat whisky he had consumed. There was no mystery either about the man himself. He had the usual bundle of French identity papers in his possession, and his people were still living at his home address near Marseille. They had not seen him for some years. He'd left home after being in trouble for stabbing his girl in a fit of jealousy. But they'd sent the money to bury him, so that he should not be buried in a pauper's grave. This left Grant with an appetite whetted rather than assuaged. He called Williams at home. When he'd been thanked for his letter, Grant said, "You said his people sent money to bury him. Didn't anyone come to identify him? No. They identified a photograph of the body. What was his profession? Mechanic. Did he have a passport? Oh, no, just the usual papers and 2 or 3 letters. Were the letters in French? Yeah. What money had he? Oh, wait a minute. I'm in notes. 22.10 in mixed notes. 18 and twopence halfpenny in silver and copper. All English? Yeah. Between the lack of passport and the English currency, it looks as if he'd been in England a good long time. Didn't he have any address in Britain? No address on him. The letters were not even in envelopes, just in his wallet. What luggage had he? Overnight case, shirt, socks, pyjamas, bedroom slippers. No laundry marks. Why, were the things new? No. William sounded amused at Grant's overt suspicion. Very well worn. Maker's name in the slippers? No. Those handmade thick leather things you find in North African bazaars and in Mediterranean ports. What else? In the case, a New Testament in French and a yellow paperback novel also in French, both well worn. Your 3 minutes are up, said the post office. Grant had another 3 minutes, but he got no nearer an explanation of B7. Apart from the fact that he had no record, either in France or in Britain, nothing was known of him. The shoes he was wearing, where were they made? Karachi. Seems to have got around. No name on the flyleaf of the testament? No name. And no one in missing persons that fits him? No one even approximately like him, it seems. He isn't missing from anywhere. Oh, well, it was wonderful of you to go to all that trouble for me. I'll do as much for you some day. Oh, I forgot to say that the sleeping car attendant's of the opinion that Martin was seen off by someone at Euston. He didn't see the man because Martin was facing him and the door was half open. They seemed very happy and friendly. They were talking about robbing an hotel. What? Yeah, the coroner said what, too. Railway chap said that they were talking about robbing the Calais. And since no one could rob a football team, it must have been a hotel. Seems that all the hotels in Scotland that are not called Waverley are called Caledonian, popularly known as Calais. They weren't serious about it, he said. And that was all he saw of the seer off. Yeah, that was all. Mightn't have been a seer off at all. He might have been just a friend who came across him on the train. Well, the sleeping car chap said that he took it for granted that this other man was a seer off because he was standing in his hat and coat. Mostly, he says, first thing passengers do is throw their hat on a rack when they get to their compartment, I mean. How was the berth booked? Or by phone? But he picked up the ticket himself. At least it was picked up by a thin, dark man. Booked a week in advance. All right. Go on about Yoghurt. About who? The sleeping car attendant. Well, he said that when he came down the train, collecting tickets about 20 minutes out from Euston, Martin had gone to the lavatory. But his sleeper ticket and the outward half of his ticket to Scone were lying ready on the little shelf below the mirror. He took them and marked them off in his book, and as he was passing the lavatory, he knocked the door and said, "Are you in B7, sir?" And Martin said, "Yes." The attendant said, "I've taken your tickets, and thank you, sir. Will you be wanting tea in the morning?" And Martin said, "No, thank you, good night." So he had a return ticket. Yeah, the return half was in his wallet. Well, straightforward enough, it seems. What did the post-mortem say? Oh, the usual light meal about an hour before death, large quantity of whiskey in the stomach and a fair amount in the blood, quite enough to make him tight. But no suggestion that he was a soak. Oh, no. No degeneration of any kind. Good healthy specimen. Would it be very indiscreet of me to ask why all this interest in a simple case? So help me, Sergeant. If I knew, I would tell you. I think I must be getting childish. It's more likely that you're bored, William said sympathetically. An overrated place, the country. In the Turley Valley, the cold, bright stillness gave place to a light wind. The wind was soft and warm, and down from the high tops came the snow water, filling the river from bank to bank. Fish flashed silver in the light as they leaped between the boulders. Grant spent his days happy and relaxed above the brown, swirling water. It filled his ears with music and his days with delight. For nearly a week, he thought fish, talked fish, and ate fish. And then one evening, he was startled out of his complacence. He saw a man's face in the water. There was time for his heart to come up to his mouth before he realized that the face was not under the surface of the water, but at the back of his eyes. It was the dead white face with the reckless eyebrows. He swore. He was no longer interested in B7, a very ordinary young man who had ended his life in a highly undignified manner. But he wrote those lines about paradise, a voice in him said. He didn't, Grant said to the voice. There's not the slightest evidence that he did any such thing. There's his face. You were B7's champion the moment you saw his face. Shut up! You wanted to know what he'd been like when he was reckless and alive. I came here to fish and nothing's going to muck that up for me. Perhaps his paradise was Tir na nog. That would fit. Tir na nog is supposed to be away out to the west beyond the outermost islands. The land of eternal youth. That's the Gallic paradise. And what guards the way to it? Islands with singing sands, it seems. Islands with stones that stand up, like men walking. And beasts that talk, do you find them too in the outer isles? You do. What are they? Seals. Oh, leave me alone, I'm fishing. Grant went back to the house at supper time in a very bad mood. He'd caught nothing and lost his peace. He drank his nice soothing bedtime drink and went to bed. But a jingle ran round and round in his head. The beasts that talk, the streams that stand, the stones that walk, the singing sand. What were the streams that stand? Was there something in the islands that corresponded to that? Perhaps a librarian might know. There must be a goodish public library in Scone. I thought you weren't interested any more, said the voice. You go to hell, he said to the voice, and fell asleep. In the morning he woke with rheumatism in his right shoulder. He lay considering this in slow amusement. There was no end to what your subconscious and your body could achieve between them. And today they'd cooked up something that would keep him off the river. His subconscious had wanted to go into Scone today and talk to the librarian at the public library, so his subconscious had set to work on the body, and between them they had made a tired shoulder muscle into an unworkable joint. Very neat. He got up and dressed, wincing each time he lifted an arm, and went down to cadge a lift from Tommy. He promised to meet Tommy for lunch and went away to find the public library. But before he'd gone far, a new idea struck him. The Flying Highlander would have come clicking over the points at Scone only a few hours ago. He changed direction, went to the Eagle Bar at the back of Scone Station. Yoghurt was there, mooning over a half-pint. Grant ordered a whisky for himself and saw Yoghurt's ears prick. "Good morning," Grant said amiably. "I've had some very good fishing since I saw you last." "I'm glad of that, sir, very glad," Yoghurt said, pretending to remember Grant. "The Tey, is it?" No, the Turley. Oh, but by the way, what did your dead young man die of, the one I left you trying to waken?" Antagonism began to wither the eagerness on Yogurt's face. "Won't you join me?" Grant added. "A whisky?" Yogurt relaxed. After that, it was easy. Yogurt still prickled with resentment at the inconvenience that he had been caused. He'd even had to attend the inquest in his spare time. He had been in on the affair from first to last, from the first appearance of B7 at Euston to the coroner's verdict. As a source of information, he was pure horse's mouth, and he gave like a beer tap. "Had he travelled with you before?" Grant asked. No, Yogurt had never seen him before, and he was glad that he was never going to again. This is where Grant's satisfaction suddenly changed to satiation. One more half-minute of Yogurt, and he would be sick. He pushed himself off the counter of the Eagle Bar and went to look for the public library. The librarian was a thin little piece of faded elegance, with a tie no broader than the black silk ribbon of his eyeglasses. Little Mr. Talisker knew all about the singing sands on Claddagh. They lay on the Atlantic side, facing the unbroken ocean, looking out to Tir Nan Og, which, as Mr. Grant might know, was the Gallic heaven. "What sang?" Grant asked. It was a moot point, Mr. Talisker said. The sands did sing as one trod on them, but he himself held that squeak would be a better description. On the other hand, on any day that provided a steady wind, the fine sand was swept along the beaches, so that they did, in fact, sing. From sand, Grant led him to seals. The islands were full of seal stories, it seemed, the translation of seals into men and vice versa. And from seals to walking stones. And on all, Mr. Talisker was interesting and informative. But streams seemed to be the only thing on Claddagh that were exactly like their counterparts anywhere else, except that they, too, often lost themselves in bog. The streams of Claddagh were just streams. Water in the process of finding its own level. Well, thought Grant, going away to meet Tommy for lunch, that, in a way, was standing. Running into standing water, into the bog. B7 might have used the word because he needed the rhyme. It wanted something to rhyme with sand. He drove home with Tommy even more cheerful than he had set out. There was practically nothing about the inquest on Charles Martin, French mechanic, that he did not know. He was that much to the good. And that was a lot. After supper that night, Grant went hunting along the bookshelves for something about the islands. He came back to the fire with an armful of books and began to go through them at leisure. They varied from the scientific, through the sentimental, to the purely fantastic. On one thing, all were agreed, however. The islands were magic. A land of brilliant sunshine and wild, lovely music, handed down from the beginning of time, from an age when the gods were young. The books lasted Grant very happily until bedtime, and while they drank their nightcaps, he said, "I'd like to have a look at the islands." Laura said, "Never heard anything so daft." "Why? Can't fish until my shoulder's better, so I might as well go exploring. It isn't that I want to get away from Clune, it's just that I've got bitten with the idea of those sands." He saw Laura begin to consider the idea. The interest of a place he had never seen before should be an ideal counteraction to self-conscious brooding. "Oh, well, what you want is a Bradshaw, I suppose. We do have one, but it's a little out of date." "As far as the services to the outer islands are concerned, it won't matter what the date of it is," said Tommy. "They don't exactly encroach on eternity, but they very nearly outlast time." So Grant found the Bradshaw and took it to bed with him. In the morning, he borrowed a small case from Tommy and packed into it the bare necessities of existence for a week or so. Laura had promised to drive him into Scone in time to catch the train to Oban. They made it, with 30 seconds to spare, and a breathless Laura pushed a bundle of papers into the open window as the train pulled out and gasped, "Enjoy yourself, my dear. Seasickness does wonders for the liver." He sat alone in the compartment with the magazines unheeded on the seat beside him. He wondered whether B7 had ever talked to anyone about his paradise. He thought not. In any case, it didn't matter how many people he had talked to about the thing, since there was no way of making contact with them. He could hardly put an advertisement in the paper saying, "Read this poem and tell me if you recognise it." Or why couldn't he? He considered this new angle. He considered it all the way to Oban. In Oban, he went to a hotel, ordered a self-congratulatory drink, and while he consumed it, he wrote to each of the London daily papers, enclosing a cheque and asking them to print an identical note in their personal column. The notice said, "The beasts that talk, the streams that stand, the stones that walk, the singing sands. Anyone recognising, please communicate with A. Grant, care of the Post Office, Moymore, Cumbershire." The only daily papers to which he did not send this appeal were the Clarion and the Times. He did not want Clun to think that he'd taken leave of his senses. The gateway to Tir na Nog. N. Todd, proprietor, came in to welcome his guest. "You'd better come ben to my office and warm yourself," Mr. Todd said. Grant asked his host for a drink. "The magistrates took away the licence from my predecessor. I haven't yet got it back, so I can't sell you a drink. There isn't a licence on the island, but I'll be glad to stand you a whisky." The office was a tiny place. Grant savoured its oven atmosphere gratefully and drank the bad whisky neat as it was offered. He took the indicated chair and stretched out his feet. "To whom should I go to learn about the island?" "Well, there's two authorities," said Mr. Todd. "Father Heslop and the Reverend Mackay. On the whole, perhaps Father Heslop would be better." Do you think he's the more knowledgeable?" "No, they're about 50-50 as far as that goes, but 2/3 of the islanders are RC. If you go to the priest, you'll only have 1/3 of the population against you, instead of 2/3. Better see Father Heslop anyway. I'm a heathen myself, so I'm an outcast from both flocks. But Father Heslop is for a licence, and Mr. Mackay's dead against it." He grinned and refilled Grant's glass. "Did you ever have a visitor called Charles Martin staying here?" "Martin? No, not in my time." "If a visitor doesn't stay at the hotel, where would he be likely to stay? In rooms?" "No, no one lets rooms on the island. They'd stay either with Father Heslop or at the manse." In the morning, Grant was gratified to find that in spite of the cold wind and wet weather, his rheumatism had entirely gone, being no longer needed by his subconscious to provide an alibi. He put on his Burberry and tacked round the harbour front to the shop. In the shop were several men from the fishing boats in the harbour, and a little round man in a black raincoat who could be nothing but a priest. Grant edged in beside his reverence and waited with him while the fishermen were being served. After that it was plain sailing. The priest picked him up, and he had 5 witnesses to it. He went out into the gale with Father Heslop and strolled home with him. Or rather, they beat up against the wind together, shouting remarks to each other above the noise of their flapping garments. It was good to go in from the blast to a warm turf fire. Because he knew he was an object of curiosity to Father Heslop, as he was to everyone else on the island, Grant said that he'd been fishing with relations in Scotland but had to stop owing to a bad shoulder. And because he'd been bitten with the idea of the singing sands on Cladda, he'd taken the chance of coming to see them. He supposed that Father Heslop was well acquainted with the sands. Oh, yes, of course, Father Heslop knew the sands. They were on the west side of the island, facing the Atlantic. It was no distance. Grant could walk there this afternoon. Grant then asked him if he'd ever known a Charles Martin who'd been interested in singing sands. No, Father Heslop had never met a Charles Martin as far as he could remember. Had he come to Claddagh? Grant did not know. He went out into the blast. For an hour he walked, along a flat grey road through a flat grey desolation. To his right, distant in the mist, was a hill, the only visible height. Every now and then the wind on his left flank would send him spinning sideways off the road altogether, and he struggled back, half amused, half irritated. And then suddenly the wind smelt salt. And in less than half an hour he came on it without warning. There it lay, in front of him, the Atlantic. And if it was not beautiful, it was nevertheless impressive in its sweep and simplicity. The dirty green water roared onto the beach and broke in a flash of white that was vicious. To the right and left, as far as the eye could see, there was nothing else in all the world but green torn sea and the sands. He stood there looking at it, and remembering that the nearest land was America. Not since he'd stood in the North African desert had he known that uncanny feeling that is born of unlimited space, the feeling of human diminution. Grant walked down to the edge of the water, let the tumult roar over him. He felt warm and alive and master of himself, admirably intelligent and gratifyingly sentient. He walked back up the sand, absurdly and extravagantly glad to be a human being and alive. He was happy. As he came down the slope to the harbour, he looked up at the hill in the mist and decided that tomorrow he would climb it. In the morning he ran into the Reverend Mackay in the post office and felt that he was distributing his favours very successfully. Mr. Mackay was on his way down to the harbour. He condoled with Grant about the rough weather, but supposed one had to take holidays when one was given them. "You'd be amazed if you could see the islands in June, Mr. Grant. The air is so hot you'll see it dancing before you, and the mirage as mad as ever it was in the desert." Were you in North Africa? Oh, yes. Mr. Mackay had been in North Africa with the Jocks. And believe me, Mr. Grant, I've seen odder things from my window up in the manse there than I ever did between Alamein and Tripoli. I've seen the lighthouse on the point there, standing halfway up the sky. And as for those rocks by the sea, they can turn light and transparent and move about as if they were walking through a set of the Lancers. Grant considered this with interest, and ceased to listen to the rest of Mr. Mackay's discourse. They parted, and he went away to spend the rest of the day on Claddagh's solitary hill. From the top of the hill he had the whole Hebridean world at his feet. He was happy up there, thinking about Mr. Mackay's mirages and the stones that walked, thinking, as he never ceased for any length of time to think, about B7. Here were the singing sands, the talking beasts, the walking stones, the streams that ceased to run. What had held B7 in bondage to this bleak world? From the top of the hill at Claddagh, Grant sent B7 a salute and a blessing. But for B7, he would not be sitting above this sodden world feeling like a king, newborn and self-owning. He was something more than B7's champion now. He was his debtor, his servant. "How long do gales usually last in this part of the world?" Grant asked his host after supper. 3 days is minimum," Mr. Todd said. Be better to fly back when you go than cross the Minch in this weather. Most people fly nowadays. It occurred to Grant that he might indeed fly back. It would be a pretty severe test, the severest he could subject himself to. If he faced it without wincing, then he could pronounce himself cured. He would be a man again. But he would wait a little. It was too early yet to ask himself the question. In the company of the whooping wind, he quartered his bleak kingdom. He spent the evenings with his legs stretched out to the office fire, listening to Mr. Todd's tales. He ate enormously. He put on weight visibly. He slept as soon as his head touched the pillow and woke only when it was morning. And on the 6th morning, he stood on the great flat of white sand, waiting for the plane to pick him up on its way back from Stornoway. The great bird idled up to them along the sand, and for a moment Grant panicked. But the casualness of everything loosened his rigid muscles almost as soon as they'd stiffened. In the clinical order of an airport, panic might have conquered, but here on the open sand, with the crying of the gulls and the smell of the sea, it was a thing one could take or leave. So when the moment came, he put his foot over the last step with nothing more than a slight heart-quickening. At the mainland airport, he climbed down onto the tarmac and wondered what would happen if he did a war dance of joy there and then. Instead, he went to the telephone booths and asked Tommy if he could pick him up at the Caledonian at Scone in about 2 hours. Tommy could and would. Clune lay very peaceful in its green hollow, and Grant looked at it as one coming home victorious. Last time he'd driven up that sandy road, he'd been a slave. Now he was a free man. He'd gone out to look for B7 and had found himself. Laura came out to meet him at the doorstep and said, "Alan, Mrs. Mair says there's a whole sack full of mail waiting for you at the post office. I take it you haven't advertised for a wife?" "No. Oh, just for a bit of information," he said, going with her into the sitting room. "The Oban train must have been on time for once," Laura said, remarking on his early arrival. "Oh, he flew back," Tommy said. He said it casually, unaware that the fact had any importance. Grant looked over at Laura and saw her face light with happiness. She turned her head to him and smiled. Had it mattered so much to her then? Dear Lala. Dear, kind, understanding Lala. In the morning he went away to interview Mrs. Mair at Moy Moor. Mrs. Mair hoped that he had a secretary and presented him with a paper knife, very tarnished, with a thistle head made of amethyst. He took it gratefully, hoisted the sack into the car and went back to Clune. In his own room he polished the little knife until it shone, emptied the bag on the floor and slipped the knife into the first letter to come to hand. It asked him how he dared expose to the public gaze the words the writer had written with such pain and heart-searching under the orders of her spirit guide Azul. It was like being publicly exhibited without clothes to see her own precious lines so wantonly laid bare. 13 other correspondents claimed to have written the lines, without spirit guidance, and asked what was in it for them. 5 sent the completed poem, 5 different poems, and claimed that they were the author of it. 3 accused him of blasphemy, and 7 said he was plagiarising from Revelations. 1 directed him to Apocrypha, 1 to the Arabian Nights, and 1 to Rider Haggard. 2 suggested subscriptions to poetry magazines, and 1 offered to teach him to write saleable verse. 1 said, "If you are the A. Grant I sat through the monsoon with at Bishanpur, this is my present address." And 1 said, "If you're the A. Grant I spent the night with in a rest hotel in Amalfi, this is just to say hello, and I wish my husband was as good." 1 sent him particulars of a Clan Grant association, 9 were obscene, 3 were illegible. There were 117 letters. The one that gave him most pleasure was the one that read, "I've fathomed your code, you bloody traitor, and I shall report you to the special branch." Not one of them was any help at all. Ah, well, it had been a shot in the dark. He had at least had some amusement out of it. Now he could settle down and fish until the end of his sick leave. That night, going to sleep, he considered what he would do if he retired. Not as a prospect, but with speculation. What would it be like to retire? To retire while he was still young enough to begin something else? One of the really charming facets of the game was the thought of Bryce's face when he read his resignation. It was a delicious thought. On the river next morning, he fished his favourite pool below the swing bridge and conducted delightful conversations with Bryce. He would lay that written resignation on the desk himself, in person. Then there would be some really satisfying chat, and he would walk out into the street a free man. Free to do what? To do things he had always wanted to do and had had no time for. To mess about in small boats, for instance. To get married, perhaps. Yes, to get married. With leisure, there would be time to share his life. Time to love and be loved. This lasted him very happily for another hour. About noon, he became aware that he was not alone. He looked up and saw that a man was standing on the bridge, watching him. He was standing only a few yards from the bank, and since the swing bridge was motionless, he must have been there for some time. "Your name Grant?" asked the man. He sounded as if he might be an American. "You the guy who put the advertisement in the paper?" "Yes," Grant said, and began to reel in. "Won't you come down, Mr. The man moved off the bridge and came down the bank to him. He was youngish, well-dressed, and pleasant-looking. "My name is Cullen," he said. "Tad Cullen. I'm a flyer. I fly freight for OCAL. You know, Oriental Commercial Airline Limited?" It was said that all you needed to fly for OCAL was a certificate and no sign of leprosy. But that was an exaggeration. OCAL cared nothing for your grammar, your manners, your nationality, or your looks, as long as you could fly. You had to be able to fly. Grant looked at Mr. Cullen with a double interest. "Look, Mr. Grant, I know those words in the paper were just some kind of quotation that you wanted identified or something like that, and I can't identify them. But you see, Bill used words like that one night when he was a bit high. Bill's my buddy, and I thought maybe the quotation might be a place. I'm afraid I'm not making myself very clear." Grant smiled. "Am I to understand that you've come here looking for me?" "Yeah. You see, that place with talking beasts and the odd scenery sounded like a nightclub. You know, one of those got up with oddities to impress the customers. That'd be Bill's mixture, especially in Paris. And it was in Paris that I was to meet him." For the first time, a gleam of light appeared. "You mean that you were due to meet this Bill?" "Yeah, he didn't show up. It was very unlike Bill. That's why I was so worried. Not a word of explanation, not a message left at the hotel. It's funny, isn't it, that he would book a room and then not turn up to occupy it and not send a word in explanation?" "Very strange indeed. But why were you interested in my advertisement? I mean, in connection with Bill?" "Bill what, by the way?" "Oh, Bill Kenrick. He's a flyer like me with OCAL. Best friend I ever had. Well, Mr. Grant, when he didn't turn up, I thought about what other ways there were of communicating with people. Telephones, letters, and whatnot. Then I thought of the newspapers. So I got the Clarion and then the Times. There was nothing there. Someone said, why didn't I try the morning news? Well, there didn't seem to be anything from Bill, but there was this thing of yours that rang a bell." Having heard Bill gabble something along those lines made me notice it and be interested. Are you with me? Oh, entirely. Go on. When was it Bill talked about the odd landscape? Oh, he didn't talk about it at all. He just babbled one night when we were all a little drunk. Bill doesn't drink, Mr. Grant. Don't want you to get the wrong idea, but now and then we have a night out like other people, and it was on one of those nights out we were all drinking toasts. And Bill said, "It's a paradise," and then gabbled a piece about talking beasts and singing sands and whatnot. What routes does Bill fly? Oh, he's flown all sorts. Lately he's been flying between the Gulf and the South Coast. Arabia, you mean? Oh, yeah. It's a damn dreary route, but Bill seemed to like it. Me? I think he was too long on it. Why, had he changed at all? Mr. Cullen hesitated. Not exactly. He was just the old Bill, easy-going and nice, but he got so that he couldn't leave it behind him. He would pore over maps of the route as if he'd never flown the hop before. Why this interest in the route, do you think? Well, I did think maybe he was figuring out a way to avoid the bad weather areas. One time he came in very late after being blown out of his way by one of those terrific hurricanes that come out of nowhere in that country. We'd nearly given him up that time. And you think Bill changed after that experience? Well, I think it left a mark on him. I was there when he came in. He seemed to be a bit still back there, if you know what I mean, not really listening to what you said to him. It became an obsession with him. Yep, that's about it, I suppose. Did he have other interests? He read books, Mr. Cullen said, in an apologetic way, as one confessing a peculiarity in a friend. Oh, they'd as likely as not be about Arabia. Yes, said Grant thoughtfully. Arabia, to all the world, meant one thing. Sand. When he'd had the feeling that morning in the Scone Hotel that singing sands did actually exist somewhere, it was with Arabia that he should have connected them. So we'd planned to spend our leave in Paris, Mr. Cullen was saying, but he changed his mind, said he wanted a week or two in London first. So we arranged to meet the Hotel Saint-Jacques in Paris. He was to meet me there on 4th March. When? Said Grant, suddenly still, like a man with a target in his sights. On the 4th of March, when Bill Kenrick should have turned up in Paris, the London mail had come into Scone bearing the dead body of a young man who was interested in singing sands. Why did Bill choose Paris? Asked Grant. Why does anyone choose Paris? It wasn't because he was French. Bill? No, Bill's English. Very English. You don't happen to have a photograph of your friend, do you? Said Grant. Well, I have one at the hotel. Could I bring it to you sometime? No, I'll walk down to Moy Moor with you now. You will? Oh, you're certainly very kind, Mr. Grant. Do you think you've got a line on this thing? Bill and I have been together quite a time. And then, after a pause, I'm really very worried about Bill, Mr. Grant. Yes, it's certainly very odd. That was nice of you, Mr. Cullen said unexpectedly. What was? Well, not to say, don't worry, he'll turn up all right. Can hardly keep my hand off people who say that. I could strangle them. Moy Moor Hotel was whitewashed and cheerful, and the trees behind it were coming into leaf. Mr. Cullen had a front room looking across the road to the hills beyond. The young man took some photographs from his pocket-book and riffled through until he found what he was looking for. Here it is. Fred, it isn't a very good one, just a snapshot, you see. There were perhaps a dozen young men in the photograph, which had been taken on the veranda of some beach house. Grant swept a swift glance over their laughing faces and was conscious of a great relief There was no one there that he'd... And then he saw the man on the bottom step. He was sitting with his chin tilted back a little, as if he had been in the act of turning to say something to the men behind. And it was just so that his head had been tilted back against the pillow in compartment B7 on the morning of the 4th of March. "Is that your friend?" Grant said, pointing to the man on the bottom step. Yeah, that's Bill. Have you met him somewhere?" I could hardly swear to it." "Oh, I don't want you to do any swearing. Do you know where you met him? I mean, do you remember?" "Oh, yes, I remember. I saw him in a compartment, a sleeping berth compartment of the London Mail, when it was running into Scone on the morning of the 4th of March. "You mean Bill came here? To Scotland? What for? Did he tell you? Did you talk to him?" "No, I couldn't." "Why not?" Grant put out his hand and pushed his companion gently backwards into the chair that was behind him. "I couldn't because he was no longer alive." There was a short silence. "I'm truly sorry, Mr. Cullen. I wish I could pretend to you that it might not be Bill, but it's my belief that it is." After another little silence, Cullen said, "What happened to him?" "He had a fair load of whisky and fell backwards against the solid porcelain wash basin. It fractured his skull." "But if he was alone, how can anyone tell what happened to him?" Cullen said, beginning to come alive and be angry. "That was the finding of the coroner's court in London. He had died, according to the post-mortem, shortly after leaving Euston. By English law, a sudden death is investigated by a coroner and a jury. In this case, there had been the most exhaustive examination and tests by the police. They knew almost to the mouthful how much whisky he had drunk before his death. And the skull injury was consistent with a backwards fall against just such an object as the porcelain basin." "How'd you know all this? How did you come to see him, anyway?" "When I was on my way out, I came across the sleeping car attendant trying to rouse him, and I found later that I'd picked up by accident a newspaper that had tumbled off his berth. And in the stop press, the blank space, you know, someone had been penciling some lines of verse. The beasts that talk, the streams that stand. I wanted to know where the lines came from." "Why? What should you care?" "I had no choice in the matter. The thing ran round and round in my head." "Do you know anyone called Charles Martin?" "What has he got to do with this?" "According to the police, the man who was found dead was a French mechanic called Charles Martin." "Then, if the police are satisfied that the man was a Frenchman called Martin, then why in thunder should you decide he was Bill Kenrick?" "Because I'm the only person in the world who has seen both the man in B7 and that snapshot. It may be a poor photograph, but it's a very good likeness indeed." "Yes," Cullen said slowly, "it is." "Did you tell the police? I think it's a case for Scotland Yard." "I don't think the Yard would thank us. You have no evidence that Bill Kenrick didn't duck out of his own accord, that he isn't having a good time on his own until it's time to go back to Oakhal. I can say, of course, that in my opinion, that face in the snapshot is the face I saw in compartment B7. Scotland Yard will say that I'm entitled to my opinion, but that the man in B7 is one Charles Martin, a native of Marseille." "You're very smooth in the part of Scotland Yard, aren't you?" "I ought to be. I've worked there more years than I care to think about." "You mean that you are Scotland Yard?" "I don't carry my cards in my fishing clothes, but if you come up to my host's house with me, he will vouch for my genuineness." "Oh, no. Of course I believe you. Mr. Grant?" "Inspector, but we'll stick to Mr. since I'm off duty." "Well, Now that you've accepted me as genuine, and you know that my version of Scotland Yard's reaction is not only accurate, but straight from the horse's mouth, what are we going to do? Lying awake with his eyes on the ceiling, letting the patterns in his mind slip and fade into each other like trick camera work in a film. It was that way his mind worked best. He still had no idea why Bill Kenrick had journeyed to the north of Scotland when he should have been travelling to Paris to meet his friend. Still less had he any idea why he should have been travelling with another man's papers. But he was beginning to have an idea as to why Bill Kenrick developed his sudden interest in Arabia. Somewhere on one of those flights over that damned dreary route, Kenrick had found something that interested him. And that interest had begun when he'd been blown far off his course by a dust storm. So this morning, Grant was going back to Scone to find out what might possibly have interested Bill Kenrick in the desert. And for that, of course, he was going to Mr. Talisker. Mr. Talisker was delighted to see Grant and helpful about his new search. Arabia? Oh, yes, they had a whole shelf full of books about the country in the reference room. Grant went through the row of books, gutting each with a swift, practised eye. If he had any last lingering doubt that the man in B7 was Bill Kenrick, it went when he found that the desert part of southeastern Arabia, the empty quarter, was called the Rub al-Khali. So that's what robbing the Khali had been. After that, he devoted his interest to the empty quarter, and presently a phrase caught his eye. Inhabited by monkeys. Monkeys, said his mind, talking beasts. He turned the page back to see what the paragraph had been talking about. It was talking about Wabar. Wabar, it seemed, was the Atlantis of Arabia, the fabled city of Ad ibn Kinyad. Somewhere in the time between legend and history, it had been destroyed by fire for its sins, for it had been rich and sinful beyond the power of words to express. Its palaces had housed the most beautiful concubines and its stables the most perfect horses in the world. It stood in country so fertile that one had only to reach out a hand to pluck the fruits of the soil. There was infinite leisure to sin old sins and devise new ones. So destruction had come on the city. It had come in a night with cleansing fire. And now Wabar, the fabled city, was a cluster of ruins, guarded by the shifting sands, the cliffs of stone, forever changed place and form, and inhabited by a monkey race and evil jinns. No one could approach the place because the jinns blew dust storms in the faces of those who sought it. That was Wabar. And no one, it seemed, had ever found the ruins. It had been every explorer's dream to be the discoverer of Wabar, but the sands and the jinns and the mirages had guarded it well. Was that what Bill Kenrick had seen? Empty palaces in the sand? Was that what he had gone out to look for when he began to come in late as a habit? Bill went back again and again. He studied maps. He read books about Arabia. And then he decided to come to England. Grant sat back and let the stillness fall around him. Bill Kenrick came to England. And about 3 weeks later, when he's due to meet his friend in Paris, he turns up in Scotland as Charles Martin. Why the masquerade? Whom was he going to visit as Martin? Grant went to call on Mr. Talisker in his little office. Who would you say was the greatest authority on Arabia in England today? He asked. Mr. Talisker smiled. There were a swarm of great names, he said, but he supposed that only Heron Lloyd ranked as a really great authority. He had stature and integrity and a great reputation. He had done some spectacular journeys and had considerable standing among the Arabs. Grant thanked Mr. Talisker and went to look up who's who. He wanted Heron Lloyd's address. Then he went away to book 2 seats on the morning plane to London. He had qualms about the air journey, but not very serious qualms. He could hardly recognise, when he looked back at him, that demon-ridden, frightened creature who'd stepped down onto Scone platform less than a month ago. The terror was no longer there. Grant went down across the moor to look for Tad Cullen by the river. "I'm going back to London tomorrow morning. Can I come back with you, Mr. Grant?" "I meant you to. I've booked 2 seats on the morning plane." He sat with Tad Cullen to give him the news. Yeah, but that wouldn't be much to get excited about, would it?" Dad said. "Few ruins." "The man who found Wabar would make history. He would be a celebrity." Tad's ears pricked. "A celebrity? And you think Bill will have gone to see this fellow, this Lloyd guy?" "To someone in that line. Lloyd is head and shoulders above the rest, so the chances are 20 to 1 that Bill would choose Lloyd." "So we find out when and where he saw Lloyd and pick up his trail from there," Tad said. "What are you hoping for from this Lloyd guy?" "I'm hoping that it was Lloyd who saw him away at Euston. They were talking about the Rub al-Khali, remember? What sounded to old Yuggert's ear as Rob the Khali. Does this Lloyd live in London?" "Yes, in Chelsea." "I hope he's at home." "I hope so indeed. Now, I'm going to have a last hour with the Turley. If you can bear to just sit and think the problem over for a little longer." He fished until the light level warned him that it was evening, but he caught nothing. This was a result that neither surprised nor disappointed him. His thoughts were elsewhere. He no longer saw Bill Kenrick's dead face in the swirling water, but Bill Kenrick's personality was all around him. Bill Kenrick possessed his mind. London was a misty grey with scarlet trimmings, and Grant looked at it with affection. He changed into his best town suit, went round to the garage, and reclaimed the little 2-seater that he used when on his own business. Number 5 Britt Lane took some finding. The manservant who answered his ring appeared to be an Arab. He ushered Grant into a tiny room and was back in a few moments. "Will you come in, please? Mr. Lloyd will be very happy to see you." He followed the man up the narrow stairs. Watching Heron Lloyd as he was made welcome, Grant reminded himself that this man had done journeys that had made history in the world of exploration. "Mr. Grant," Lloyd said, shaking hands, "Mahmoud says that I can be of service to you." He took a box of cigarettes and offered them. Grant took one and apologised for his intrusion. He wanted to know whether a young man called Charles Martin had applied to him at any time for information about Arabia. "Charles Martin? No. No, I don't think so. He was also known as Bill Kenrick." Lloyd said, "Oh, Kenrick? But he was here only the other day. Why should he have an alias?" "I don't know that myself. I'm making inquiries about him on behalf of his friend. We've discovered he died as the result of an accident." "Oh, so that's why he did not come back," Lloyd said. Poor boy, poor boy. "What happened to him, a car smash?" "No, he had a fall in a train and fractured his skull." Poor wretch, pity. I could have supplied the jealous gods with a dozen more expendable in his place. Why did you want to know if he'd come to see me?" "When he died, he was masquerading as Charles Martin with a complete set of Martin's papers. We want to know at what stage he began to be Charles Martin. We were almost certain that, being bitten by the desert, he would come to see some authority on the subject in London." "I see. Well, it was most certainly as Bill Kenrick that he came to see me." Lloyd smiled a little. "He came to me with one of those commonest propositions that are habitually put to me. An expedition to the site of Wabar. Do you know about Wabar?" It's the fabled city of Arabia, the city that was destroyed by fire because of its wealth and sins. And Kenrick thought he had discovered that site. No, he was sure of it, poor boy. You think that he was wrong, then? I think what poor Kenrick saw was the crater of a meteor. I've seen the place myself. I think I have a photograph somewhere. He got up and picked a photograph album from one of the bookshelves. Grant looked at the photograph that Lloyd laid before him. See, Lloyd said. Even on the ground, one cannot be sure that the thing is not a collection of human dwellings. How much more misleading it must be from the air. Yes, agreed Grant, and did not believe it. From the air, the crater would have been plainly visible. But he was not going to say that to Lloyd. Let Lloyd talk. He was growing very interested in Lloyd. It was not you who saw him off at the station, to Scone? Asked Grant. No. Why was he going to the Highlands? We don't know. He said nothing to you that might provide a clue? No. Perhaps he'd found a backer who lived up there. There's Kinsey Hewitt, of course. He has Scottish connections, but I think he's in Arabia at the moment. Well, at least Lloyd had provided the first reasonable explanation of the flying visit. Kenrick had found a backer at the last moment and had dashed north to meet him. That fitted beautifully. Lloyd said, By the way, if the boy was travelling as Charmartin, how has he been identified as Kenrick? Oh, I travelled on that train to Scone. I saw him when he was dead and grew interested in some verse he'd been scribbling. Scribbling? On what? Oh, on a blank bit of paper, Grant said, wondering why it should matter what Kenrick had been writing on. No. Had he Kenrick belongings that made the identification easy? No, he was buried as Charles Martin. Lloyd paused. That's so typical of that careless Scottish way of dealing with sudden death. They're always very smug about their lack of inquest. Myself, I think Scotland must be an ideal place in which to get away with murder. Oh, there was an inquest, as it happens. The accident took place shortly after the train left Euston. Ah, Lloyd thought this over. What about this man who saw him off? Could he have been Charles Martin? He could, I suppose. Yeah, it's a very curious business altogether. This accident, you say, had... I suppose there's no doubt that it was an accident, no suggestion of a quarrel? No, it was a fall that could have happened to anyone. Distressing. It was time that Grant took his leave. Well, I've taken up a great deal of your time. I'm most grateful. You've already been so kind that I hate to ask you... What is it? May I perhaps borrow the photograph of the meteor crater? I should very much like to show it to Kenrick's friend. I promised to return it in perfect... But, of course, you may have the photograph. Lloyd handed it to Grant and saw him to the door courteously. Grant drove down to the river and along the embankment. The old place looked very much as usual, he thought. And so, too, did the fingerprint department once he got there. Cartwright looked up as Grant's shadow fell across him. You been away? Yes, I've been fishing in the Highlands. If you're not too busy, can you do something off the cuff for me? It's a difficult job. Dead easy. Just here, in the lower right-hand corner of this photograph, there's a beautiful thumbprint, and at the back, I think you'll find a nice set of fingertips. I want to check them with the files. All right, will you wait? I'm going to the library. I'll come back. In the library, he looked up Kinsey Hewitt and went to telephone. A woman with a pleasant voice answered and said that her husband had been in Arabia since November and was not expected back until May. Grant thanked her and hung up. It had not been to Kinsey Hewitt that Bill Kenrick had gone. He went back to Cartwright. You've got the photograph, or am I too early? Not only got it, but I looked it up for you. The answer's no. Thank you all the same. I'll take the print with me. Good night.
You don't seem awfully sweet
on this guy, Tad Cullen said when Grant had finished his story over the telephone. Don't I? Look, Tad, tomorrow I'd like you to do the round of the more obvious places where Bill could have been staying. And Grant gave him the name of 20 of the more likely places. So sleep well, we'll crack this thing between us. The next day, Tad arrived flushed and triumphant. I don't know how you ever thought of the Pentland, but you were right. That's where he stayed, all right. Bill checked out on 3rd of March. Did you ask about his luggage? Oh, sure. They said that Mr. Kenrick had left nothing. That means he took them to a cloakroom, to be ready when he came back from Scotland. If he'd meant to fly when he came back, then I suppose he would leave them at Euston. If he meant to go by sea, then he may have taken them to Victoria. No, we can but try. Would you know his cases if you saw them? Oh, yes. In fact, one of them's mine, if it comes to that. Then it'll be up to you to spot the cases. Tad, can you clean windows? Right, what? Clean windows. You may have to before this is over. Come on, let us go and collect those suitcases. All his papers and personal things will be in one of them, and I'm hoping that it will include a diary. That'll be all we need, if it's there. But nothing was there. Nothing at all. They began with the obvious places: Euston, the airport, Victoria. From the likely places they moved on to the mere possibles, but there were no familiar cases on any of the shelves. Grant dropped into the Astwick Street police station. Hello, Inspector, what can we do for you? I'd like to know who cleans the windows of 5 Britt Lane. Oh, Mr. Lloyd's place. Richards does them. He stables his barrow and things in that mews further along Britt Lane. At the corner of Britt Lane was the Sun, where Richards played darts, and it was to the Sun that Grant went. Eventually he had Richards to himself in a corner with a pint. Would you take a pupil tomorrow, Grant said. Number 5 Britt Lane. Nothing's going to be abstracted from the house and nothing upset. Richards lifted his mug. What time will your pupil be coming along, Inspector Grant? 10 o'clock, do? Make it past. Grant left a message asking Tad to come to the flat in the morning. Then he had dinner and went, thankfully, to bed. As he was falling asleep, a voice in his head said, because he knew that there was nothing to write on. What? He said, coming awake. Who knew? Lloyd. He said, on what? Yes, well. He said it because he was startled, because he knew that there was nothing to write on. Grant lay thinking about this until he fell asleep. Tad arrived before Grant had finished breakfast. You mean you were serious? Why am I going to clean Lloyd's windows? Because it's the only honest way of getting a foot inside the house. On the desk in the big room there's an engagement book. I want to know Lloyd's engagements for the 3rd and 4th of March. Well, you think he maybe travelled in that train? I should like to be sure that he didn't, anyhow. Returning after lunch, Tad fished a piece of paper from his pocket. Did you find the book? Asked Grant. Oh, yeah, I had only to pick it up. It's no good to us. He was busy, it seems. Grant looked down at Tad's childlike copy of the entries in Lloyd's engagement book, and as he read them, the full absurdity of his suspicions came home to him. How could he ever have dreamed that Heron Lloyd could possibly have been moved to murder? Because that's what he had been thinking, wasn't it? That somehow, in some way that he could not guess, Lloyd had been responsible for Bill Kenrick's death. He would go back to where he was before he saw Lloyd, back to the company of Bill Kenrick. He looked across at Tad. "I'm deserting you for a day or two. I'm flying over to see Charles Martin's family." Marseille was the usual noisy, crowded place filled with impatient taxi drivers and the smell of stale coffee. But the sun shone and the mimosa displayed its pale yellow in prodigal mass. He found the Martins and listened to the little they had to tell. Charles was a bad boy, wilful and lazy. They'd had no news of him in 5 years. Grant asked if they had a photograph of Charles. Yes, they had several. They showed him the photographs, and Grant saw why Bill Kenrick dead looked not too unlike Charles Martin. Thin, dark, with marked eyebrows. On the doorstep, he asked the Martin family if they had their son's papers. Only his personal ones, they said. The official ones were still with the Marseille police. So, Grant produced his papers, asked the Marseille officials for a loan of the Martin papers. He drank a sirop and signed a receipt, and he caught the plane to London on Friday afternoon. He had only 2 more days of sick leave before he would be swamped by that demanding life waiting for him on Monday. Sitting just as Grant had last seen him in the fingerprint department, he put Charles Martin's papers on the table. "When can you do these for me?" "French identity papers? What are you getting into?" "If it comes off, I'll tell you all about it. I'll pick up the prints tomorrow." "Well," said Tad joyously when he heard Grant's voice, "what did you get out of the Martins? Anything worthwhile?" "I'm afraid not. We're sunk, aren't we?" "Well, we have 48 hours more." "Mr. Grant, you're an optimist." But Grant did not feel very optimistic. He went out into the wet haze and bought himself an evening paper. The paper was a Signal, and the sight of the familiar heading took him back to that breakfast at Scone 4 weeks ago. He thought again how constant the headlines were. The cabinet row, the dead body of the blonde in Maida Vale, the street accident. Even plane crash in Alps was common enough to rank as constant. Yesterday evening, the dwellers in the high valleys of Chamonix saw a rose of flame break out on the icy summit of Mont Blanc. The Signal's style was constant too. The next morning began, as it always did, with the rattle of china, as Mrs. Tinker, his housekeeper, set down his early morning tea. He heard the door close, came to the surface and reached for the papers. It was there on the front page. "Shangri-La really exists. Kinsey Hewitt's great find," said the morning news. "Astounding news from Arabia." Grant went on to the prose of the triumphant explorer himself. "The empty quarter. Attention caught by a plane that came twice in 5 days and spent time circling. 2 hours to the ridge. A valley of astounding beauty. Isolation. Unaware what lay beyond the desert. Monkey god in stone. Wabar. Volcanic convulsion. Wabar. Wabar." Grant lay and stared at it. So that was what Bill Kenrick had seen. This was his paradise. This was what he had come to Heron Lloyd to Heron Lloyd. He flung the news away and leapt out of bed. Would Lloyd have read the papers yet? He would very much like to be at 5 Britt Lane before Lloyd opened his morning paper. It would be sweet to watch Lloyd take the news. He had murdered to keep that secret his own, to ensure that the glory should be his, and now the secret was front-page news, and the glory belonged to his rival. At 5 Britt Lane, his summons was answered not by Mahmoud, but by a large woman in felt slippers. "Mr. Lloyd?" he asked. "Oh, they've gone up to Cumberland for a day or two. Mahmoud, too. Will you leave a message?" No, he would come back. His name didn't matter. He went back to the flat and the telephone rang. It was Tad. But he lied, Tad kept saying. That guy lied. Of course Bill told him all that. Yes, of course he did. Listen, Tad, I'll tell my story to the Yard, of course. But proving that Charles Martin was Bill Kenrick is quite a different matter. Until lunchtime, I shall be writing out a statement for the Yard. Come about 1 o'clock. In the afternoon, I must turn the whole thing over to the authorities. He'd begun to write when he remembered that he'd not yet picked up the papers he had left with Cartwright. He dialed the number. Could Cartwright send a messenger round with those papers? He'd be very grateful. He went back to his writing, and was conscious only in a dim way that Mrs. Tinker had brought in the second post. When he raised his glance from the paper, his eyes fell on the envelope beside him on the desk. It was a foolscap envelope, rather stiff and expensive, and addressed in a thin, cramped hand that managed to be at once finicking and flamboyant. Grant had never seen Heron Lloyd's handwriting. He recognised it instantly. He put out his hand for the envelope. It had been posted in London. The letter was dated Thursday morning. My dear Mr. Grant, or should I say Inspector? I have this morning had a letter from my follower Paul Kinsey Hewitt announcing his discovery in Arabia. It's ironic that it should have been the Kenrick youth who, by a climatic hazard, was responsible for bringing to him, too, the knowledge of the valley's existence. As far as I could judge, the young man's only virtue was a capacity for continence in speech, and it was important from my point of view that his tongue should go on being unwagged. Charles Martin was my mechanic. He was a repellent creature. I was not sorry when he died in mid-desert. His papers lay in my baggage and came back to England with me. I remembered them when it was necessary to silence the Kenrick youth. It was Kenrick's plan to go back to the east, until I should join him to set out on our expedition together. When he told me that he'd arranged to go to Paris by the night ferry on the 3rd, I booked a sleeper berth to Scone in the name of Charles Martin for the same night. Then I suggested that, since I was going to Scotland on the same evening, he should dine early with me at Brit Lane and see me off at Euston. He agreed. We dined, and at Euston I sent Kenrick to pick up my sleeper ticket while I went ahead. By the time Kenrick rejoined me, I had found my compartment and was waiting for his arrival. We stood talking for a little. Presently I indicated my small overnight case which was lying on the bunk and said, "If you open my case, you'll find something in it for you." He bent over to unfasten the locks. The position was perfect. I took from my pocket the most satisfying weapon ever devised by man, a rag and a few handfuls of sand. A skull would crack like an eggshell, very neatly, without blood or fuss. He gave a small grunt and fell forward over the case. I locked the door and dragged him under the berth, out of sight. The whistle went. I put the outward half of my ticket to Scone, together with my sleeper ticket, on the small shelf below the mirror, walked down to the lavatory and waited. Yuggott tapped at the lavatory door and announced that he had found my tickets and taken them. I heard him go through to the next coach and walked back to B7 and locked myself in. I retrieved Kenrick from below the bunk, rubbed his head on the edge of the wash-hand basin and laid him on the bunk. I removed the contents of his pockets and substituted Charles Martin's pocketbook and its contents. Kenrick was still alive, but he stopped breathing as we were running through the yards at Rugby. From then on, I don't think that I missed anything, did I, Mr. Grant? The details were perfect, even to the crushed hairs in the wash-hand basin. In the case that I was leaving behind were old clothes of mine, well worn and washed, and a French Testament. The case also, of course, contained the all-important bottle. I'd plied Kenrick with whisky at dinner. He remained sober, to all appearances sober, but both his blood and his stomach would be whisky-sodden when he died. So was his compartment when I'd finished with it. At Crewe, I unlocked the door, shut it behind me, and stepped down from the train. In my hat and coat, no one took any notice of me. I came back to London on the midnight train. It was not until you called to see me that I knew about the scribbled words on the newspaper. But it would not be of interest to the authorities, who had accepted the young man as Charles Martin. I'd planned to fly out next week. The letter from Kinsey Hewitt alters all that, of course. The fruits of my achievement have been taken from me. But no one can take from me the achievement itself. If I cannot be known as the discoverer of Wabar, I shall be known as the author of the only perfect murder ever perpetrated. This evening at dusk, I light my own pyre on the highest slope of the highest mountain in Europe. Mahmoud does not know this, but he would be very unhappy without me, so I'm taking him with me. My funeral pyre will be a beacon to light all Europe, and my achievement in murder a tidal wave that will sweep Kinsey Hewitt and Wabar into the waste paper baskets of the world's press. Mr. Grant, it was clever of you to discover that Charles Martin was Kenrick, and I salute you. What you are not clever enough to discover is that he did not die by accident. What no one would ever be clever enough to discover is that I am the man who killed him. H.C. Heron Lloyd. Grant became aware that Mrs. Tinker was showing Tad Cullen into the room, and that she must already have been in without him noticing, because an envelope from the yard was lying beside him on the desk. Grant pushed over Lloyd's letter for Tad to read and broke open the envelope from Cartwright. When Tad had finished, he looked up with a shocked face. "That's the crash that was in the evening papers last night. The crate in flames on Mont Blanc." "Yes." "So he would have got away with it after all?" "No. Lloyd forgot so obvious a thing as fingerprints. Of course he did it in gloves. Nothing he touched in that compartment would have any print of his. But what he forgot was there was something in that compartment that he had handled before." What was that?" "Charles Martin's papers. They're covered with Lloyd's prints. Murderers never think of everything." "How's the old man's rheumatism?" Grant asked Sergeant Williams on Monday morning. "Oh, very good, I think. Well, then I better go in while the barometer is still high." Grant was happy. That morning at the airport, Tad had said, "Mr. Grant, I want you to know I'll never forget what you've done. You couldn't bring Bill back, but you've done something much more wonderful. You've made him immortal." And indeed, they had buried Bill Kenrick 6 feet deep in oblivion, but he, Alan Grant, had dug him back up again and set him in his rightful place as the discoverer of Wabar. He'd paid back the debt he owed that dead boy in B7. Bryce greeted him amiably, said that he was looking well, and suggested that he might go down to answer an appeal from the Hampshire police, which had just come in. "Well, if it's all the same to you, sir, I'd like to get the Kenrick murder off my chest first." "What?" "This is my written report on it," Grant said. As he laid the thing down, he remembered in a vague, surprised way that what he had planned to lay down in front of Bryce was his resignation. What odd notions occurred to one on holiday. He was going to resign and get married. What an extraordinary idea. What a most extraordinary idea.